This is our 17th lesson on the Introduction to the Bible. We're looking at early Bible translations in this lesson. Let's go back and kind of review what we've gone through. We're looking at divisions of the Bible, and then we looked at language in which the Bible was written, writers of the Bible, and the time frames in which the Bible was written. Now we're looking at early Bible translations. And we'll look in the next lesson at English translations. We'll do that second lesson tonight. It was essential to have translation of the Bible in the hands of the common people in order to spread the gospel, because everybody couldn't read it in Greek or Hebrew, depending on the language that they have. Since the Lord's church depends solely upon the Bible for its authority in spiritual matters, it must have an accurate translation for any people that are to be taught. So that is mandatory. It's not an option. The ancient translations that we're going to be looking at, we don't look at all of them, are valuable in determining the readings of the Bible. They'll help us. Septuagint, and sometimes that's Septuagint, translation of the Old Testament, the 3rd century BC translation, was a translation from the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament into Greek. And the Greek that it was into was on the edge of the beginning of the Koine Greek. So it was whenever the classical was kind of going out and the Koine was coming in. So it's not actually Koine, it's not actually classical. It's kind of on a transition period. It was used by the early church for their Old Testament, by and large, because 72 men were supposed to have translated it. The designation LXX, which is Roman numeral for 70, is used as an abbreviation for the word Septuagint. Now, I'm going to refer to it as the Septuagint rather than Septuagint. And so the abbreviation and designation for it is LXX. That's how it's designated in the various sources when they talk about it. I will lay some more information. The Septuagint translation of the Old Testament derived its name from the Latin word Septuaginta, meaning 70. And in order to give the translation credibility, the Jews who were using the Septuagint made claims that 72 men translated the whole Septuagint, LXX, in a short period of time, implying that they were doing this by inspiration. Right? But don't believe that was the case, but that was how they presented it. The name Septuagint was originally the designation of the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, just the first 5 books of the Bible, just Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. But came in time to refer to the Greek translation of the whole Old Testament that was adopted by Christians. The translation of the Pentateuch was completed in the 3rd century BC, and the remainder was completed before about 140 BC. So it wasn't all translated at one time. My understanding is that the Pentateuch was translated first, and then some of the other books were translated over a period of maybe another 100 years. This would make the Septuagint, the LXX, to be the oldest translation of Scripture in any language as far as we know. We know of no other translation of the Old Testament Scriptures prior to this. The Jews of Egypt spoke Greek because the Greek Empire had spread, Macedonian Empire, spreading the Greek language. Alexander the Great had spread it, and it was in rulership over Egypt. The Ptolemies were the ones who were Ptolemy, Ptolemy. They were the rulers, and they were Greek-speaking people. So the Jews of Egypt spoke Greek as their primary language. Therefore, they needed a copy of the Scriptures in their language. They weren't speaking Hebrew in their day-to-day living, by and large. If Greek were our main language, we would not need an English translation. We just use the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Greek New Testament is what we'd use. Now, understand that the Greek, modern Greek, is a little bit different than the Koine Greek. We've already gone through that. So even the modern Greek people would have a Greek translation of the Greek. So that sounds kind of funny. But basically what it would boil down to is they would have to put it in some of the modern words and the modern spelling and so forth. Josephus and Philo, they lived in the time of our Lord, and they were writers. They were Jewish writers, and you can obtain their books. I have both their books. Josephus is a lengthy treatise. Philo is too. Both of them claim that the translators of the Septuagint were divinely inspired in their translation. That's their claim. I believe their claim is wrong, but nonetheless, that was what they claimed. Some of the books of the Septuagint are translated quite well, like the Pentateuch, but some are paraphrased and some have a great amount of interpretation inserted into them. So you have to be very careful with it. So, but the Pentateuch is probably pretty good. It's particularly well translated in the Septuagint, okay? Jewish rabbis, particularly the Pharisees, revised the Septuagint. And they did this after the church began to use the Septuagint to convert Jews, and particularly Greek-speaking Jews. So they made a revision of Septuagint. I believe there's even evidence that they made some revisions in the Hebrew Old Testament. They made changes in the wording. I think there's some evidence they did, but I deal with that in my flood book. Aquila, not the Aquila of the Bible, in 128 AD made revisions. The Aquila of the Bible was no doubt long dead by that time. Okay. Symmachus in the late 2nd century AD also made changes. And so they made changes in the Septuagint translation. The early church uses Septuagint LXX extensively. There are passages in the New Testament that appear to be quotes from the Septuagint. There's some that appear to be. The early church quoted the Septuagint so effectively that they were converting Jews, so the Jewish leaders, Pharisees, commissioned Aquila to produce a new translation. And he made some changes in it. Aquila's version changed the wording of the Septuagint so that to make it harder to use it to convert Jews. So they would see the dishonesty in them. Some of the early church fathers used the term Septuagint to refer to any translation of the Hebrew, Aramaic scriptures into Greek. So they began to use it differently because once they translated and they made another translation into Greek from the Hebrew and Aramaic. Remember that we pointed out that the Pentateuch was pretty good translation. It was pretty accurate. Some of the other books were not so accurate. So whenever there were translations made of some of the other books to get them up to speed to make them better translations, they still referred to the Septuagint. So the term Septuagint is thrown around among the ancient writers, used kind of loosely. We kind of need to understand that. Some of the early church fathers limited the term Septuagint to the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, the Torah. Others applied it to the whole Old Testament in Greek. The letter of Aristus is supposed to give the account of how and why the Septuagint was translated from the Hebrew to the Greek. When I say Hebrew, I mean Hebrew and Aramaic both, okay? The letter of Aristus is almost certainly a fabrication. It was written about 150 BC. What this proves is that the Septuagint existed at that time. Now, this is significant because we have in the Septuagint, we have prophecies of Jesus. So we have prophecies that we can absolutely date without any shadow of a doubt that they existed in 150 BC. I'm not saying they were written at that time, but they were in existence at that time. We have proof of it. So these prophecies of our Lord that he fulfilled in the first century, about nearly 200 years later, after 150 BC, he fulfilled them about 30 BC, so that's about 180 years later. But these prophecies we know were in existence 180 years before Jesus fulfilled them. So this is powerful evidence that the prophecies were only from God, because only God can know the future. And so now we go further. I think this is a very useful argument for establishing the credibility of the scriptures. Now, I'm not saying that the scriptures just started in 150. We got proof they existed in 150. And so they had been in existence for some time before that. Some in the Lord's Church of the 2nd and 3rd centuries claimed the Septuagint was translated by the direction of God. They began to make that claim. Again, I don't think there's enough evidence to support that claim. I think the claim was made in a pragmatic way to shore up the efforts to convert unbelieving Jews. Now, we get into a study, which we won't get off into in this course, but we get into a study of when miracles ceased in the New Testament times. I believe they ceased near the end of the 1st century AD. But I believe we can establish, if we took time and did it, that miracles ceased about the time of Malachi, about 400 BC, 450 BC. And they didn't start up until the time of the beginning of the Lord's ministry. Now, we have prophets, Anna the prophetess, and I believe Simeon was a prophet as well. And of course, we have John the Baptist speaking by inspiration. So that's when it started back up, I believe, that time. Since they had ceased between the time of Malachi and the beginning of the New Testament, when the LXX was translated, it was not translated by miraculous guidance. I believe that's a false claim. The claim that it was translated by direction of God, the first bullet up here, this bullet, I believe is false. Okay. All right. Now, the Jews had what they called Targums, and they're Aramaic translations of the Old Testament. And the Targums were kind of almost like they were more of a paraphrase to a certain extent, but they're really an interpretation. And there's the Hebrew word for it. It means translation or interpretation. These Targums show how irrational some of the Jewish thinking had become. They had become very irrational. We see this irrationality where they took and made arguments that I can make a vow and swear in the name of the temple, or the gold in the temple, but if I swear by the temple, I have to keep my word. Remember, in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, and prior to that, there's some problems with it. Even in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus deals with it. So they had that problem in the 15th chapter of Matthew. They had a problem with claiming that their property was dedicated to God, so they couldn't take care of their parents. And we see that in the parallel accounts in Mark. And so they became very irrational in their thinking. And these Targums show how irrational some of the Jewish thinking had become. We're not going to spend time on them, but they employed allegorical methods of interpretation. And the allegorical method of interpretation was employed. Everything's basically an allegory. The allegorical interpretation of Scripture, one way they used to reject the plain prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Very plainly, he fulfilled prophecies, and so they rejected them because they were allegories. Some of this thinking was already evident in the times of our Lord. So we see, even the time of our Lord, some of the problems the Lord ran into was bad hermeneutics on the part of the Jews, and they used that bad hermeneutics to lead the people astray. And so hermeneutics is a key principle of interpretation of the Bible. And I believe that the Bible tells us how to interpret the Bible. We need to derive it from the Bible. We have to use sound reasoning when we derive it. I've been writing my book, Logic and Debate for Christians, and hopefully I'll have it printed sometime this year. The Jews claimed that Ezra translated from Hebrew to Aramaic when he read Nehemiah 8:8. Now that's entirely possible, and I wouldn't rule that out, but he was speaking by inspiration of God. He was a prophet. And so that's not going to work when we come down to the Septuagint and the Targums that came later. And they read in the book, in the law of God, distinctly, and they gave the sense. So they read it distinctly so that they understood the reading. So right here, they read it in Hebrew and then they gave the sense. I think probably this is true. That the Jews claim here that he read the Hebrew and then read it and translated it into Aramaic for them. I think that's probably the case here. And here's a midrash, and that's one of their wild interpretations. This is back from Genesis 1:31. And God saw all that he had made and found it very good. And there was evening, there was morning, a sixth day. That's good. That's Genesis 1:31. The Midrash, Rabbi Naaman said in Rabbi Samuel's name. So he spoke of what Rabbi Samuel, some guy, rabbi named Samuel, had claimed. Behold, it was good refers to the good desire. Behold, it was very good refers to the evil desire. It only says very good after man was created with both the good and bad inclinations. In all other cases, it only says, and God saw that it was good. That is the wildest, far out interpretation of that passage I've ever seen. Because the inclination to do evil, they had not yet sinned yet. Adam and Eve had not yet sinned whenever this is stated of them. So when God had created them, they sinned later. So again, this interpretation is just, I believe, is strange, very strange. But this is the kind of interpretation you find throughout this type of writing. Now then he goes on and says, and this is a translation from some CO publications, can then the evil desire be very good? That would be extraordinary, but without the evil desire, however, no man would build a house, take a wife, and beget children, thus said Solomon. Well, you have to have an evil desire to build a house, take a wife. That's crazy. What kind of interpretation is that? Beget children. Again, I consider all labor and all excelling in work, that it is a man's rivalry with his neighbor. And again, he's taking some words from Solomon and taking them completely out of context and doesn't really understand what he's talking about. And so this is the Midrash, and that's their interpretation, just an example of it. A really far out interpretation. Syriac versions will get away from the Midrash and the Targums. The old Syriac of the 2nd century AD, that's when they dated. I'm not even sure they're dating these right, because I would think that it might be this, if it's 2nd century, it might be early 2nd century AD, used in Syria. There is not a complete manuscript for this translation. So we don't know, we have some fragments, we have pieces of it. We don't have a complete translation. Peshato, and Peshato means simple. It's the same idea as the Latin. We'll get to the Latin later, but it's the common or the simple version. It's a revision of the old Syriac, and so we do have copies of them. There are other Syriac versions. The Heraclean Syriac was another translation. There was no standardized authority that translated into a good translation. People would make their translations and then other people would copy them. The Syriac versions, the writing of the Syriac looks like this. I can't read that, but that's Syriac. That's their writing, what it looks like. And it was spoken in the area of Syria and the Fertile Crescent. It's a dialect of the Middle Aramaic, so it's a form of the Aramaic language. And in the Old Testament, of the old Syriac version was translated from the Hebrew and Aramaic into that Syriac language. The Septuagint had an influence on these translations, so when they translated into the Old Testament, they also employed the Septuagint. That region, a large number of people still spoke Greek at that time. It also appears that the Jewish Targums influenced these translations as well. So they got some of the ways they translated stuff from the Targums. That was some of that weird stuff that we just read. The New Testament of the Syriac version was translated from the Greek New Testament. So it was translated from the Greek New Testament, of course, not from the Hebrew Targums, Aramaic Targums. Here's the region where the Syriac language is spoken and was spoken. And the metropolitan sees, and this is getting into the corrupted church as it had corrupted itself and had bishops over, and they call them sees, over regions. And the metropolitan sees in Transoxia in India and China. So we see those green circles, and we see also the pinkish and the kind of a purplish areas. There's the Aramaic speaking, that's kind of pink colored. Syriac speaking is a little bit darker pink, and almost red, it's purplish red, the Syriac speaking areas in 2010. Still today, there's regions where they speak it today. This was about 12, 14 years ago when this was made, this chart or this graph. We also have the Mongol tribes. They come into this region and they adopted Syriac Christianity according to this. What they mean by that is the church as it existed at that time, and I believe it had already gone into apostasy. Then we have a group down in India, down at the very bottom of the side, it's kind of a goldish color, and this is the St. Thomas Christians, they're called. Okay? And so that's a group that is, they think we're pretty much like that group that we have here, Aramaic. They use Aramaic and Syriac as well. Old Latin then was not one translation, but what happened here was the Old Latin was a 2nd century AD. The claim is made it may have been even earlier than that, even late 1st century. But the Old Latin, the Old Testament, was translated from the Septuagint. What happened here was wealthy Christians would want a copy of their own scriptures. So they would hire someone to translate it for them, hire a scribe to translate it, and he would translate for them and make their translation. So each copy of the Old Latin is a different reading. It's a different translation. They may read pretty much the same, but they come from mostly the Old Testament, by and large, best I can tell, comes strict from the Septuagint, and the New Testament comes out of the Greek New Testament. And so we have, each manuscript is a different translation. It's not a standardized translation, but individual translation of the Greek New Testament and the Septuagint Old Testament. The diversity in the old Latin manuscripts brought about a need for a standardized translation. So the Western Church, and this is the apostate church that had already developed into the Roman Catholic Church and was in a state of flux and was changing. It had already been got into apostasy. A plan to have a common translation. And this was called the Vulgate. And the Vulgate means common. And this was a translation. The Vulgate is a pretty good translation. A man named Jerome did this about AD 400. Rough figures, maybe 390 or somewhere thereabouts. The Vulgate was a standardized translation designed to replace the old Latin translations, which remember they're all different. And so this was a good idea. And but of course the church was already in apostasy by this time. Roman Catholic Church used the Latin Vulgate for about 1,000 years as their version. And they only spoke Latin in their masses, they called them the worship times. And it was in Latin. The common people, many of them couldn't even understand it, people of other languages. And so they just went through rituals. Several of the early English translations were from the Latin Vulgate rather than from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Now, that's something you need to remember. So the Latin Vulgate had a tremendous influence of some of the early translations. They were from it. The Latin Vulgate was translated from the Greek New Testament and the Aramaic and Hebrew Old Testament. So it was from the originals originally. But Latin doesn't have the definite article, so there's some differences in it in Greek and certainly differences in Latin and English. So again, you can't get a one-for-one translation into Latin and then back into English from Latin. The first book printed on the printing press in Gutenberg's printing press was the Latin Vulgate Bible. Remember, the word Vulgate just means common. There's a picture of it. That's the Gutenberg printing press. That Bible, I bet that Bible was worth vast sums of money because it's one of the printings from Gutenberg's press. Then we have Coptic versions. Now, the Coptics were people who lived in Egypt. So we have Coptic versions in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. These versions were in the language of the people of Egypt. Now, there's different dialects in Egypt, so there's different ones of the Coptic versions. And Augmenic, Sub-Augmenic, Bohairic, Middle Egyptian, Phaearamic, Proto-Bohairic, and Sahidic. All of these are different dialects. So each one of them had their own translation. So we get they're called the Coptic versions. And so each one has its own translation. They have copies of. Now these copies survived because they're in a dry climate. And so they didn't deteriorate. Some of the other versions had to be copied. And so we have in regions where there was wetter climate, they would deteriorate. And so they had to make copies of them. It doesn't mean that they're inferior, the ones that are copied later, as long as the copyists were doing good jobs, of course. The climate of Egypt was, of course, favorable for preserving manuscripts, so we have a number of these copies. Arabic was spoken in northern Egypt. Interestingly enough, it was one of the later translations because the bulk of the people in the northern Egypt spoke Greek as well. So they took the Septuagint of the Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. They didn't need their own translation, and there was no need for it because the vast majority of the people already spoke Greek. But so their translation came later. Phaearamic and Sahidic were spoken in southern Egypt. Other dialects were spoken by various subgroups of the society. Herrick was one of the latest of the Coptic translations because the people in northern Egypt spoke Greek and they didn't need a translation, but they got one later. The rest of the Coptic version is translated from the Septuagint rather than from the Hebrew and Aramaic, so keep that in mind. So any flaws in the Septuagint would have gone into these translations. The New Testament of the Coptic version was translated from the Greek New Testament. Now that's good. So that's a good source. In Ethiopia, south of Egypt, and that's the 4th century. They date this the 4th century. It may have been earlier than that, the language of Ethiopia. I think some of these datings, and when I read about them, I question how they've dated them at the 4th century and 3rd century and so forth. I'm not sure. I'm giving the dates that are given in standard reference books, but I haven't seen any evidence to support the claims that the Ethiopic was first translated in the 4th century AD. I think it may have come much earlier. Right. The Gothics, the Goths, were another race of people. Supposedly this was 4th century AD as well. That would be 300s when they say 4th century. We're living right now in the 21st century. Okay. The Armenian in the 5th century, supposedly, and that's Armenia, that's east of Turkey, what's now the nation of Turkey, and that's the language of Armenia. The Arabic, and this would be the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia would be the primary country that speaks that language, but that language, due to the Quran being a book that spread, unfortunately, due to it, there's a number of people that do speak Arabic. It's the language of Arabia, supposedly in the 9th century. Again, I don't know that this dating is good. The Slavic people would be Russian, Ukrainian, and some of the other smaller nations in that region. And so this is a Slavic language. This is the language of the Slavic people. This was a translation supposedly in the 9th century AD. The Old Testament of all these 5 translations were translated from the Septuagint. All of them came out of the LXX, the Septuagint. The church had split, and there was an Eastern church and a Western church. The Western church spoke Latin, and that was their primary language, and the Eastern church spoke Greek. And the Russian language is a subset of the Greek language. It's considered a Hellenic language. And the structure of Russian is, when I studied Russian, I noticed very quickly that it's structured very much like Greek. I studied Greek first, made it much easier to learn Russian. The Testament of all of these 5 translations was translated from the Greek New Testament. So translation between there. Because the Roman Catholic Church did not and still does not accept the Bible as their sole authority in spiritual matters, they oppose the translation of the Bible into any language other than Latin. And so they didn't want people to know that they were not following the Bible. So keep them in ignorance. Because most of the early translations were in the area where the Orthodox Church was dominant. So the Orthodox, they'll be the Eastern Church, and they spoke Greek, but they were making translations for the people into their languages. So the Orthodox Church was not doing as much bad things as the Western Church, the Roman Catholic. Most of them teach error, of course. The hands of the Roman Catholic Church are stained with the blood of thousands of people they murdered in the name of killing heretics. This includes those who translate the Bible into other languages. So they killed them. What is interesting is that the Roman Catholic Church was using a translation while persecuting those who translated the Bible. I think that's an oddity. It's almost an oxymoron. Very strange. The origin of the Samaritans, the Samaritan Pentateuch, is recorded in 2 Kings 17, verse 24 through 41. We won't look at that, but some think the Samaritans were a mixed race of Jews and Gentiles, and this might be true, but it's not evident from the text of 2 Kings 17, 24 through 41. I think what happened is they moved in a race of other people, and then there was a remnant that they were another race of people, and that's evident from 2 Kings 17. And they were transplanted there by the Assyrians and possibly then intermarried with the remnant of the Jews that were left in the land. That's what I think happened. And so I view that as happening. So that the Samaritans are indeed a mixed race of people. They got some Jewish background, but they have some. If you read this, 2 Kings 17, you see they began to be attacked by lions and bears. And so they said, because we're not honoring the God of this land. So they got someone to bring them the Pentateuch. And so they began to try to follow the Pentateuch. And that's where they started following it. We see it in the text of the Bible. If you read in 2 Kings, you can see that. Well, they took the Pentateuch. Now remember, the Pentateuch, when about 400 or somewhere thereabouts BC, was up to that time, the Hebrew was in the Aramaic Phoenician script. And then after that time, they began to write it in the Aramaic script. So the script changed about maybe 350 BC, somewhere thereabouts, around that time. We don't know exactly when it changed, but it changed during that time, approximately 350 BC. But this was, 2 Kings 17 was before, because they got carried away into captivity in 722 BC. So this is some 300 years before this time, maybe 350 or so. Before this time, the 2 Kings 17 is there. Let's read it, and we'll go through it some. We won't get into it too much. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, carry thither one of the priests who be brought from thence, and let them go and dwell there, and let them teach them the law of the God of that land. So what I said to you was they began to be attacked after they moved them in by a wild beast, and so they wanted to know they need to appease the God of the land. They're idolatrous in their thinking. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel and taught them how they should fear Jehovah. And of course, at this time, they got copies of the Pentateuch. And so they got the Samaritan Pentateuch. Howbeit, every nation made gods of their own and put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. So they're still worshiping idols at this time, okay? But they're trying to appease both gods. Remember, they're polytheistic. You can read Ezra 4 and Nehemiah 4 and get more information about this, okay? It's likely the Samaritans had intermarried with the remnant of the northern kingdom that was left there. Some remnant was left. So it's likely they intermarried, but they're not trying to adopt the religion of the God of the land. This began nominally, at least, following the law of Moses in 2 Kings 17. As I pointed out a minute ago, the Samaritan Pentateuch, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that's what they had at this time, is written in the Phoenician script. Now, I believe it's probably the reason that they only took the Pentateuch was because some of the other books were being used by the southern two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and the remnant of the various tribes that had fled down there. I don't think Judah just had Judah and Benjamin. I think if you study it, you'll see all the tribes, or at least most of them, can be documented as having fled to get away from the idolatry and came to the southern tribe. So there was a remnant of these other tribes in Judah, even after Jeroboam introduced his calf worship. But the Samaritan Pentateuch is written in the Phoenician script. That dates it early. It differs in some places from the Masoretic text. It agrees with the Masoretic text most of the time. We'll be looking at that just a minute. This is a powerful argument for the existence of this Pentateuch existing quite some early, much before even the Septuagint translation. Be there to be translated into the Septuagint, but we're dating it much earlier now. There's about 6,000 variants between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. Sounds like a lot, but about 1,800 of these variants, the Samaritan Pentateuch agrees with the Septuagint. And Samaritan version seems to try to smooth out apparent discrepancies, try to smooth them out. And textual problem. Samaritan Pentateuch has Mount Gerizim as the place of sacrifice added to the Decalogue. Decalogue being the Ten Commandments, of course. This explains what happened in John 4:19. The woman said unto him, unto Jesus, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Well, definitely he was more than a prophet. He was a prophet, but he's the very Son of God. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye say, ye meaning you Jews. Notice it's addressing Jesus, but she uses the plural. You Jews say, he is plural you. In fact, you and your and ye are all plural in the King James American Standard in both the Old and New Testament. Thee, thou, and thine are singular pronouns. And so our fathers worship in this mountain, Mount Gerizim, and ye, you Jews, say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. And so it's clear that she is appealing to the Samaritan Pentateuch, which had been changed to word that they were to worship in Mount Gerizim. Okay, so that's how it reads. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem shall you worship the Father. Okay, let's do it. So we won't go any further, let you read it for yourself. But this is what explains that. It tells them that they're worshiping Mount Gerizim rather than in Jerusalem. The existence of the Samaritan Pentateuch demonstrates that there had not been any major corruption of the text of the Pentateuch since about 700 BC. These minor changes are minor. The vast majority of it reads exactly the same as Masoretic text. And so this goes back to about 700 BC. Now, how do we know this? Was there a mingling of the text? No, there wasn't. There was no commingling of these texts after 700 BC because the Jews and Samaritans are always enemies. So they didn't commingle their text. Infidels claim the Pentateuch was written about 400 BC in accordance with the discipline known as higher criticism. This won't wash. Some infidels, atheists, agnostics, some of those deny the inerrancy, those who deny the inerrancy in the scriptures. Even some in the Lord's church take this view that there's errors in the Bible. I think they're just way far out. And they're actually implicit atheists, I think. They appeal to the Samaritan, when they appeal to the Samaritan Pentateuch as evidence of corruption of the original text of the Pentateuch. So it got corrupted. Yeah, well, the Samaritans corrupted it for their own purpose. They did it on purpose. The Jews weren't designed to corrupt it. Infidels claim the Pentateuch was written about 450 BC in accordance with the discipline known as higher criticism. Asks the question, how did the Samaritan Pentateuch wind up in the Phoenician script if the Pentateuch was not written until about 400 BC and it was written in the Aramaic script? How did they get it into the Phoenician script? And so that's a problem. And so they were using this, and they were at war with one another, the Samaritans and the Jews were, during this time of 400 BC onward. So they were not They were not commingling their text. Are there any questions? All right.
Appreciate all the material.